All right, hello and welcome. Today we are diving into one of the most personal, passionate, and, let's be honest, pretty combative letters from the ancient world. We're talking about the Apostle Paul's second letter to the Corinthians. And it is a total masterclass in persuasion, written by a leader whose entire reputation is hanging by a thread.
And that brings us right to the heart of the matter, the question that drives this entire letter. So think about it. If you're trying to prove you're the real deal, that you have authority, your first move probably isn't to make a big list of all your failures and disasters, right? Well, that is exactly what Paul does. So how in the world could that possibly work?
Okay, so let's get into the drama here. Paul, you got to remember, founded this community in Corinth. But now, some new, super charismatic leaders have rolled into town, and they are just tearing him to shreds. They're attacking his credibility, his character, his authority, trying to turn his own people against him. This relationship is in an absolute crisis.
And these attacks were so personal. I mean, they were brutal. His rivals are saying he's fickle, that he changes his travel plans willy-nilly, a yes and no kind of guy. They're mocking him, saying that sure, his letters sound all weighty and powerful, but when you meet him in person, his bodily presence is weak and his speech contemptible. Ouch. But Paul pushes back. He says, no, I act with godly sincerity, and my tough words aren't meant to hurt. They come from a place of abundant love for you. Now, you'd expect a leader to fight back by listing their successes, right? Their credentials, their big wins. But Paul doesn't do that. He doesn't even play their game. Instead, it's like he flips the entire chessboard over. He completely changes the rules of what it even means to be a real leader.
And this is where things get really wild. Paul starts to build his case, to prove he's authentic, not by talking about his strengths, but by giving this long, brutal list of all his sufferings. It is, without a doubt, the strangest resume you will ever see.
I mean, just look at this list from chapter 11. It's just relentless. Prison, beatings, stoning, shipwrecks, constant danger, hunger, you name it. While his opponents are bragging about how strong and polished they are, Paul just shows his scars. He's basically saying, you want to see my credentials? Here they are. This is what my commitment to you has cost me.
And this line right here perfectly captures his whole strategy. See, he's not just complaining. He is deliberately taking the very thing his enemies point to as a sign of his weakness, his infirmity, his suffering, and he's turning it into his #1 reason to boast. He's completely redefining what real power and leadership actually look like.
Okay, so let's really dig into the core idea of this whole letter, what I'm calling the weakness paradox. Why on earth does Paul believe his weakness is actually his greatest strength? What's the logic behind this bizarre claim? Because this isn't just a clever debating trick, it's the absolute heart of his worldview.
To explain this whole paradox, Paul uses this incredible metaphor, treasure in earthen vessels. Seriously, this one image unlocks his entire philosophy. It's such a beautiful and powerful way of explaining where he thinks true power really comes from.
So, what's an earthen vessel? Well, think of it like the cheap, disposable Tupperware of the ancient world. Common, fragile, easily broken clay pots. Paul is saying that we, our human bodies, our messy, fragile lives, we are these disposable jars. But the treasure inside, that's the power of God. And here's the point. When the jar is weak and cracked, nobody can mistake the incredible light shining through as coming from the jar itself. It has to be from the treasure inside. His weakness makes God's power totally obvious. And here it is, the absolute climax of his whole argument. He doesn't just put up with weakness, he takes pleasure in it. Why? Because he's realized that the moment he is at the very end of his own strength, that's the exact moment a much greater power can start working through him. For Paul, human weakness isn't a roadblock to power, it's the runway for it. Okay, so this is a really fascinating idea, but what does it mean for everyday life? Well, this whole theology of weakness has immediate, real-world consequences for how the Corinthian community is supposed to live, both with each other and with the rest of the world.
So the first application is internal, for the community itself. Apparently, there was someone in the church who had caused a lot of trouble, but instead of calling for some harsh punishment, Paul, who totally gets grace because of his own weakness, urges them to forgive the person and reaffirm your love. The message is clear. A community that understands that God's power shows up in weakness should be a community known for grace and restoration, not for judgment.
The second application is external. In chapter 5, he lays out their mission. He says, look, because God has reconciled you to himself, you now have a job to do. You are now ambassadors for Christ, and your job is to carry this same message of peace and reconciliation out into the world. It's a straight line. When you experience grace in your own weakness, it empowers you to offer that same grace to other people.
So, after defending his ministry, after explaining this radical theology of weakness, and after calling them to action, Paul makes one final, absolutely brilliant move. He turns the spotlight away from himself and shines it right back on them.
See, the ultimate test isn't whether Paul is some impressive super apostle with a slick presentation. The real test is whether their own faith is real. He's basically saying, stop putting me on trial and test yourselves. Is this message of grace, this power and weakness, actually alive in you? His goal was never just to win an argument. It was to call them back to something real and authentic.
And that leaves us with a really powerful question for our own lives. I mean, we live in a world that is obsessed with strength, with influence, with showing off a perfect, successful life. Paul's radical argument forces us to ask, what kind of power, what kind of authenticity, what kind of grace are we overlooking by constantly trying to hide our own cracks, our own vulnerabilities, our own earthen vessel nature? What treasure might be waiting to shine through?